Today we're going to be talking about using Wolfram Alpha in the economics classroom. Like I introduced myself earlier, I'm Aish Vardhani, and I work in educational partnerships here. Before I begin with my economics subject areas that I want to discuss today, I'd like to start with a small introduction to Wolfram Alpha. From your poll responses, I know that a lot of you are familiar with our technologies and across multiple different Wolfram offerings, which is fantastic. We always like to see that. But for those of you that are not familiar with Wolfram Alpha, Alpha is a knowledge-based computational engine. So what that means is that it accepts queries in natural language and it computes to return the result on the fly. So if I was to ask Wolfram Alpha a query, I can ask it in natural language, just plain English, and it's accessible via the web on at wolframalpha.com. And it's knowledge-based in that Wolfram Alpha contains an immense amount of data on every subject imaginable. And that is going to be a big theme in my talk later today. So to give you an overview of the different subject areas and topics that Alpha can handle, we have, of course, math, chemistry, music. There's even a surprises section that I encourage you to try later. It's truly a fun section to look at. But for our focus for today's talk, of course, is economics, and there is a wonderful starting page. So rather than show you this on my presentation, I'm going to show you this on the browser. So if you go to wolframalpha.com, there's an examples page, and I've chosen socioeconomic data to give you an idea of the different types of economic data and demographic information and statistical information that we have in Alpha that you can now mine. Also, there's a section under money and finance with stock data, with mortgages and loans and salaries, and more information than honestly one person might need in the economics section. So all of this is accessible on the web. Just go to wolframalpha.com. One point that I'd like to make before I move into my presentation is this. When you go to wolframalpha.com, this is going to be what you see, right? It's going to ask you, unless you're not signed into your Wolfram ID, it might ask you to sign in, and there's information here about a pro account and so on. You might have noticed in my other browser tab that I was signed in with my pro account under my Wolfram ID username, but this will not make a difference if you ask it a query whether you're signed into your Wolfram Alpha Pro account or if you're just using Wolfram Alpha on the web without signing into your Pro account. What do I mean by that? Supposing I was to ask it GM stock price, and so I should have remembered to type the word stock. So if I was to ask it GM stock price and I'm not signed in, it gives me this result immediately. So I know that a lot of educators who are not familiar with it assume that a lot of the functionality and the capabilities of Alpha that I'm going to share in this talk are accessible only to Pro or Pro Premium customers. This is not the case. If you have a Pro account, it does give you some extra capabilities by way of you have extra computational time that you can have, as well as the ability to upload and download data and so on. But as far as querying the computational engine and to be getting the results from that, you do not need a Pro account. I'm going to close this incognito window, though, and go back to my original signed in my account. And let's talk about some economics examples. With looking at these two pages, you should have gotten a much better idea about what are the different subject areas within economics that Alpha can handle. But I would like to discuss three specific examples that I think would be relevant in an educational setting in a classroom. The first one is an exploratory lesson that covers debt and GDP. So supposing I was to, let me just open up a new Wolfram Alpha tab here. This is an exploratory lesson, so I'm going to be asking questions about, first, international government debt. If I query that to Alpha, let's see what comes up. So as you can see, when you type a question into Alpha, the answer is being computed on the fly. It's not just giving you a stock response, but it's actually computing, and that's why it takes a couple seconds sometimes to get this result. So you can see that there is a huge number there. And it also breaks your government debt rankings by countries, and you have an access to, okay, I want to see a bigger list of countries, see more of this list rather than just the top and the bottom part of it, and you have the ability to do that. Supposing I want to, zone in a little bit more and just talk about US debt. So it auto-completes my queries for me. So again, it's computing my US debt, and as I ask it this question, I've asked this query to Alpha multiple times. One of the things that you're going to see is a graph, a historical graph of how this debt has been behaving. I'm just going to try this again here. Okay, so 19.26 trillion US dollars as of the first quarter of 2016, and it gives you a federal debt history in a linear scale, and it gives the debt to you in a log scale, and it's possible for you to change that into a linear scale like I'm doing by clicking that button. This first is my one of the points that I want to stress in my talk here is when you use real-world data to talk about concepts like debt to your students, and when you see real graphs like this that sort of allow you to trace the pattern of debt and GDP of different countries, a natural question comes up with why is this expressed in a log graph as opposed to a linear graph? Why are these vertical steps? What is the difference between expressing these vertical steps as absolute change versus a percentage change? And I worry that sometimes this is a concept that is lost if you use toy data or data that is made up, which sometimes we do in the setting of word problems and explaining concepts to our students. Whereas if you are using a real-world source of data, you can see how big these numbers truly are, and I think it goes that much bigger in explaining why certain graphs are certain ways, and these differences can be striking. Another query that I want to talk about is debt related to export-import of these countries? So supposing I was to ask US import 2000 import values 2015 minus US export values 2015 and I hit enter on this query. So I want to know what is the difference between how much the United States imported on this particular year versus how much the United States exported in that year. You see that the result is $529 billion. So we imported that much more, at least we spent that much more on importing goods than we did on exporting. And then if I want to now connect that to our GDP differences and our government debt for those 2 years. So now I'm comparing that to US government debt 2015 minus US government debt 2014, so for the previous year. And you're going to see a pretty striking number here as well, that there's a $780 billion difference between these 2 years in government debt. And you have another data point here that gives you the difference between how much we imported versus how much we exported. And it's, I think, a valuable question to ask your students is, this $528 billion extra that we spend on import over earning from export, is that one of the causes of the $780 billion increase in US debt or not? Another question that you can ask is national debt related to other common measures like GDP? When we analyzed our first tab of, world debt, is it counterintuitive that the countries that have a higher GDP also have a higher debt? Is there a simple explanation for that? Another thing here that Alpha does really nicely is your is your debt to GDP ratio. So supposing I was to look at the ratio between the US debt and the US GDP, and I'm going to do this for a couple of other countries as well. So I'm going to do this for Greece. And you see how it's got an access to an immense amount of data to be answering that question for you so quickly. And one of the things about Wolfram Alpha is that we use curated and verified sources of data. So when you get a result like this, okay, the US debt over the US GDP, this ratio for the United States, you can always access the sources button and find out where did this information come from. More often than not, your source is going to be the Wolfram Knowledge Base, which is our internal data repository of an immense amount of data that we collect and curate from sometimes third-party sources. Also, we have a dedicated team that works at Wolfram Alpha to do justice, to collect and curate data. This is data that you can trust. This is data that is citable. So when you see this is 1.05 years. Why is this ratio expressed in years first? And a student who's not seen this, we know that it can be interpreted as the number of years that you need to pay back the debt if your GDP was dedicated entirely to debt payment. So if the United States was to entirely dedicate the GDP of this country into repaying the debt, it's going to take us a little over a year to pay back all our national debt. What about Greece? And it's going to take a little bit longer for Greece to do that. And we know about the economics situation, about Greece defaulting, so it's a little bit longer. Perhaps surprising is to now try this for Japan. So I'm going to learn to type carefully first, and then type in Japan debt to GDP ratio, and you see instantly it's going to give you, that's a much bigger number. And I would posit this question to my students about, okay, so does this mean that Japan is on the verge of an economic collapse? Because I compare 3 different data points, and I know what happened to Greece, and I know that the number for the United States is at a certain level. But just comparing Greece and Japan, does this mean a certain thing? Does this mean that this one financial indicator, this debt to GDP ratio, is sufficient to predict an economic collapse or not? What other indicators should you be thinking about in this sort of a scenario? These are actual case studies that I would posit to my students to come up with an argument to either bolster this claim, yes, this is going to happen, or undermine that claim and say, no, this is not. There are a multitude of different ways in which Japan is different from Greece, and so on. And to back up these claims, depending on what indicators you choose, you have the data available in Wolfram Alpha to strengthen your claims. I would also take this a little further sometimes to bring it down to a micro level. So we're talking about debt and GDP, and we're talking about a macro level of economics. If you bring this down, does this also mean that a neighbor living a life of luxury, is that person accruing a life of debt? Or can you automatically conclude that somebody who is living a very frugal life possibly has a lot of money? It's interesting to think about these questions and to come up with a series of financial indicators that might help you answer these questions. And with Alpha, you have a verifiable data source that can help you to do that. Another situation that I wanted to bring up was Zipf's law and urban population. So as teachers in economics and mathematics, you guys might be familiar with the Zipf's law, which is one of the more interesting and mysterious phenomena in urban research. So if I was to take Zipf's law in the context of a city, then I know that it claims that the number of people in a city is inversely proportional to the city's rank amongst all cities. Well, what does that mean? What that means is that the biggest city is about twice the size of the second biggest city. It's 3 times the size of the 3rd biggest city, 4 times the size of the 4th biggest city, and you get the idea. So does this law hold true everywhere? You want to test it on US cities. So if I was to search for US cities population on Wolfram Alpha, you see that it gives you a list of the largest cities in the United States with their associated population. It tells you where it gets these data from, what the date of this data is. This is data from 2014, or data from whichever year that the data is from. So you see how you can choose more and more cities. And with the first 2 entries, it's roughly corresponding to Zipf's law. With your 2nd and 3rd, not so much. Between your 3rd and 4th, not so much. And so, Zipf's law is something that you do see manifesting in a multitude of different, places around the world, which is what makes it a very powerful but also a mysterious phenomenon. So you have a tool here that allows you to see for yourself whether these cities are obeying them or not. Does a city have to be above a particular size? Does it have to have a certain amount of sprawl beyond which it's going to obey Zipf's law? Or do you find that the smaller your city gets, the more it obeys? Does the same city behavior, is that reflected in country populations as well? So not only can you test out Zipf's law amongst United States city populations, you can also test it amongst country populations. So I can change my question to country populations, and it's going to list all the countries with their, let me try that again. So it's going to list that with all the different country populations, and that's another data set for you now to test out whether you do have this law being obeyed or not, or how much is it being obeyed, what are your outliers, and so on. Okay, so that was my second example with going over possible subjects that you can, subject areas that you can discuss with your students with the power of real-world data behind you. So the first one was, we spoke a little bit about debt and GDP and the debt to GDP ratio, and so I moved ahead of myself and I didn't come back to my slide, but we talked about Zipf's law and urban populations. The next example, a few more ideas that I have, department stores in the USA. So let's look at this. So if I was to query department stores USA, then it gives you a list of all the department stores, not only delineated by the type of stores and the number of stores that there are, but also how many stores do you have in each state, and a couple of graphs to reflect that information as well. So it's interesting to now think about a few scenarios that open up here. All of these examples that I'm giving here, I would like you to think of them in an exploratory sense with, okay, so you present, this amount of data to your students and you give them alpha. Where does this mode of inquiry take them? So you're thinking department stores in the USA. What about grocery stores in the USA? Do grocery stores and department stores follow the same sort of distribution that if a state has a huge amount of department stores, it automatically means, well, right now on my screen, you can say that that's not the case. When I was looking for department stores, it was Texas. Whereas you have California. Well, now you're comparing that to, you only need so many stores depending on the population that those stores have to service, right? So now look at US state populations. California is the most populous state. So now you have 3 different data points and a ton of interesting questions that you can now ask. Is there a correlation between these 3 things? If there is a correlation, well, at a very low level, we do know that depending on the population of your state, that's obviously an important indicator that will help you determine how much the number of department stores you need, or is the market saturated for grocery stores, and if you are trying to build a case study for, I would like to open a new store in this state, in this location, how do you determine if the market is saturated? Is the ratio of the number of stores to the state population always a constant? What does it depend on? Why do you have this interesting piece of data that one state has the most grocery stores and the most population? That's California, right? Most populous, has the most number of grocery stores, but is number 3 on the department store list, right? So these are interesting questions that it's possible to tackle, but if you are not exposing, real-world data and this sort of questioning to your students, this sort of information, these questions are not questions that will be asked at all. And that is something that, I said I'm going to be stressing on the value of Wolfram Alpha's data repository. And this is my point, is that some questions that you might naturally want your students to think about, some questions that you might want them to ask, that you want to ask them and you want them to answer, might not even be possible if you didn't have a particular piece of data staring at you. So it's, that's the idea that I want to, seed here with my department stores example. My next thought, let me scroll back to my presentation here, is about US agriculture and population growth. As you can see, we have a lot of information about population demographics in Wolfram Alpha, And it sort of also falls naturally into the flow of, we talked about grocery stores and population, and we had a couple of questions that came from that. What about agricultural arable land in the United States? So supposing I was to query United States agriculture. So let me see if I can type that without a typo. Okay, so if I query United States agriculture, and it's going to give you the annual cropland area, or the arable land in the United States. I know that this is a 2012 estimate. So this is what I mean about the data being verified and citable. It's not just, oh, this is the arable land. It goes beyond that and tells you where and when this data was, procured. So looks like it's a little under 600K square miles of agricultural land in the United States. Now you compare that with with the population of the US in 2012. So you can query, let me find an open tab here. Supposing I was to now ask population of US 2012. Okay, so there were 316 million people, which is the estimate for 2012. And you also have an estimate of the arable land. Now you have two data points that correspond to, okay, this is how many people we had to feed, and this is how much arable land that there was in this particular year. You can do this for a bunch of different years. Supposing I was to search for U.S. arable land 2006. So we're going a decade back now. Perhaps not surprisingly, I mean, if you think about it for a second, it will not be surprising that there was more arable land 10 years ago than there is today, an unfortunate, consequence of, urban development. So you have 619,467 square miles of arable land, and you compare this to the population of the United States in 2006, and, when you look at the population information here, when you scroll down below the graph, it gives you an estimate of a rate of change of population. Now, it does not do that for the arable land, of course, but it's interesting to ask your students this sort of question where, okay, so you have an idea with decades and decades of population demographic information about how this country's population progresses. You also have a bunch of data points that give you an idea about the arable land and the amount of arable land that you have in the country. You also know the rate of change of growth of the population. Now, can you estimate, discuss about, how much of arable land would you need? What would the corresponding rate of growth of arable land need to be in order to sustain this sort of a growing population? Or you can turn that around and talk about an ideal growth of population growth, or, reduction in population growth, in order to be able to sustain with the amount of arable land that you have. So it's possible to answer these sort of questions when you have this sort of data at your disposal. Another interesting thing to do would be to find out about the correlation between grocery stores and arable land. When I search for arable land Texas, so Texas, if you remember, had the most number of grocery stores, right? So I'm going to just look for this query because now I'm curious to see. Oh, I shouldn't have deleted land there. So arable land, Texas. And it can tell you that as well. So this is the amount of arable farmland that you have in Texas. The fact that you have this for Texas means that you have this for all the different U.S. states. So it would be an interesting correlation to talk about, is there a correlation between the arable land in a particular state with the number of grocery stores in that state? What about the population in the state and arable land in that state? Anything that I say for a country, you can break down into a state as well. So these are some thoughts that come with the comparing agricultural land and output and population resources. A few small examples as well are, we have a ton of data on company information and more. I know that I started this presentation by talking about GM stock price. If you remember, that's where I showed you the difference between how, if you ask the question under your pro account or you ask the question under not being in your pro account, not signed into your pro account, you still get the same answer. What if I wanted to compare two companies? So if I wanted to compare Toyota versus Honda, so now you're moving away from population demographics and things like that to a little bit more of, okay, I want company demographics, I want company information. So you see that it understands, I'm going to just run that again, that this is a automobile manufacturer. And it gives you a lot of information with the different pricing models and the physical specifications. And let me search for them as a financial entity instead. I hope that that was not too quick with me just clicking that button. A lot of data in Wolfram Alpha, I mean all the data in Wolfram Alpha is categorized under different entity types. So if you search for a particular data entry, then it depends on if you're looking for it as a name or as a automobile manufacturer, and so on. So it gives you a lot of company information. Another thing that I want to show off here is a mortgage calculator. If you attended our previous webinars where we talked about Wolfram Alpha in calculus and Wolfram Alpha in physics classrooms, then you would have seen us show the calculators quite a bit. And this comes up in economics here as well. When you just type in a mortgage calculator, you get a calculator box that is interactive at this point. So if you can change this number, this is a fixed rate mortgage. And it also gives you parameters that you can add to it. So at this point, the base parameters that you need to calculate your mortgage are just loan amount, period, and your annual percentage rate, of course. But it's possible to add these extra parameters to it. And I'm just going to go with this here. It's the amount of data that it does beyond the, the original that I find stunning is this amortization table with the payments table, with your ending balance and your yearly interest paid, and it does this for the entire duration, and that's pretty awesome. So that's your mortgage calculator. Coming back to our socioeconomic examples, okay, I'm not able to find it, so I'm going to just type it out here. The price of electricity in Iowa. So if you're doing a case study with the different states in the US and talking about maybe the living conditions there, so you're talking about how much it costs to live. There's another interesting thing that it does with comparing the value of your money between the different states. And if I remember to do that, I'll get to that as well in a couple of minutes here. But if I wanted to see the price of electricity in Iowa, then Alpha can give me that information. And it's possible for you to compare and contrast, also get historical data up to a decade ago for this information. So as you can see, Alpha is an invaluable source of trillions of different data points that you might not have even thought are available to you in a ordinary classroom. All you need is access to an internet connection and a browser, and you can get what the historical price of electricity was in Iowa for the past 10 years. And I think that that is an amazing thing to have. It's an amazing tool to have in your class to be able to get this data in your fingertips. What about the median home values? You can do that too. So supposing I wanted to find the median home value in Madison, Wisconsin, it gives you that amount of data as well. So as you can see, with Alpha's data repository, this is just the tip of the iceberg, the examples that I'm showing you here. With your creativity in your classroom, and with more important than that, when I've talked to students and I've led several outreach initiatives working in classrooms using Wolfram technologies in their classrooms, I find that these things work best, especially technology works best, when you let your students direct their inquiry in ways that they're interested in. So Alpha is perfect for that, because if you give them a tool this powerful, they're going to ask questions that are relevant to them. They're going to now move beyond working from toy problems in a textbook to, oh, I want to find out about Vermont because I care about Vermont. Maybe I vacationed there last year, and so I want to know something about that particular state. To be able to have that sort of interaction with the subject matter that you're learning is possible when you have a tool like this that can answer any of those questions for you. Another way to engage with alpha in the classroom, which is specific to not just economics, but really any subject, but I can see it being used a lot, especially in economics when you're building these case studies with thousands of different data points to prove a particular claim of yours, is we use a lot of spreadsheets, right? The more data you have, the more spreadsheets you build. Recently, we launched a add-ons for Google Drive feature with Wolfram Alpha that allows you to integrate the power of Wolfram Alpha into a Google document or a Google Sheet. So it's a feature that is now going to allow you, if you're creating a Google spreadsheet like here with apple nutrition and banana nutrition, you don't need to look up the information and manually type it in. You can just call Wolfram Alpha on that cell right there and have Wolfram Alpha compute your answer for you and populate it instantly. So if I was building a spreadsheet in my economics classroom about, population demographics or median home values or any of the trillion different directions in which I could take this, then Wolfram Alpha add-ons for your Google Drive would be an invaluable tool to be able to do that instantly. One of my colleagues wrote a really nice blog post that introduces this functionality and sort of walks you through how you can use this best. It explains it a little. So the link is there in my presentation. So I encourage you to check that out and see if this is something that you're going to find valuable. I know that I spent a little bit of time talking about, so when you have a Pro account, you can upload and download data. You get increased computational time and so on. If you have more questions about Pro account, I encourage you to bring that up in chat, and we have a few of my colleagues here who will help you answer that. And finally, if you're interested to bring Wolfram technologies into your classroom, but you're concerned about expenses involved, then I encourage you to contact education-support@wolfram.com. We have a specific grant program for educators, and it offers deep discounts on our technologies for qualifying schools and districts. So we will work with your school to find the best plan for you. So if you're interested at all, please write to us here, and we're happy to help out. We're happy to have that conversation with you to find out what best suits you. And we also have a couple of educator access and offers because you signed up and viewed this webinar. You get 40% off of a Wolfram Alpha Pro or a Pro Premium subscription for a year. So if you're interested in using that, this is the code that you need, EDU40. And we will be sending out a post-event email to everybody that registered and attended with a discount code for Pro that you can pass on to your students as well. So, and finally, if you're familiar with the Wolfram ecosystem at all, you will know about Mathematica and Wolfram System Modeler. Mathematica is our technical computing software that allows you to do everything and more that I showed you with Alpha in a programmatic point of view. So rather than querying Wolfram Alpha to ask these questions, you're actually writing programs and code that do it for you. And System Modeler is our modeling software. So there are student discounts for that as well if you're interested to pass that information on to your students. And before we go to Q&A, I'd like to end with one little comment. I used to be an educator before I joined Wolfram, and I have led several outreach initiatives here that take me to classrooms in Illinois where I work with teachers and students to use our technology to code with Wolfram Programming Lab and to use Wolfram Alpha in their classrooms and so on. And if you're an educator who has used or foresees using Wolfram Alpha in your classroom or Programming Lab or any of our other technology offerings, get in touch with us. We have a very active community. It's community.wolfram.com. We'll publish that link in chat in a few minutes here. And we have an active community of educators and developers and students who share resources and experiences and classroom stories and questions over there online. So I encourage you to join that conversation and be part of this discussion with using technology in the classroom. And it's a good conversation to have. It's an important conversation to have. So I encourage you to check out community.wolfram.com for that. I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and I hope that you got inspired with a couple of ideas to try in your classroom because of it. We're going to close out the presentation here in a little bit and move to a question-answer session where we're going to have an interactive discussion. Feel free to post your questions. I look forward to hearing them. Thank you very much.